So over the weekend, multiple news agencies called the 2020 presidential election for former Vice President Joe Biden, but minutes after the Trump campaign came out and said in their eyes, the election is not over yet. So to get reaction, all the different lawsuits being filed and what we know, let's bring in Assistant Professor of Political Science at Eastern, Dr. Courtney Broscious. Dr. Broscious, thank you for taking the time.
Hi, Tyler. Thank you for having me, and thanks to Eastern TV for reaching out. I'm excited to be here talking to you all today about the election.
So talking about the election, most important state right now it was for Joe Biden. They called it for Joe Biden this past weekend, but for President Trump too, is Pennsylvania. In order for him to get 270, if he was going to challenge anything, he needs to win Pennsylvania. So what do we know so far about any lawsuits being filed by the Trump campaign in Pennsylvania?
So I think what's interesting is that there's been this long focus since prior to Election Day around Pennsylvania and thinking about ways to delay the counting of absentee ballots, the way to challenge the extension of the deadline for mail-in ballots. And so one of the main controversies I think we're seeing is around the federal lawsuit that is geared towards stopping votes that were received after the deadline from being counted, right? So we see the Supreme Court sort of weighing in last week, saying that they're not going to provide the relief that the Trump campaign wants, but that they're going to take the case to conference. It's scheduled to go to conference tomorrow. So I think we're going to see a lot of answers coming out in the next couple of days from the Pennsylvania lawsuit, as well as lawsuits in other states.
So Justice Alito of the Supreme Court issued an order mandating that ballots in Pennsylvania received after 8 p.m. on election night be separated from those other ballots. So what impact does that have on these lawsuits filed by the Trump campaign and potential litigation moving forward?
What I think is interesting is that these ballots were already being separated. So Alito sort of cues to the Trump campaign that they might be willing to open up the inquiry into these challenges in Pennsylvania in that decision. But the county officials in Pennsylvania state officials had already decided that anything that was received after the polls closed on election day were to be segregated. So they have already been separated because of state activity. So I think it's an interesting way to approach and think about what the dynamics of the politics are here, right? We have the federal Supreme Court sort of weighing in, saying, yes, keep them separate. We might be willing to hear a challenge on those ballots, even though the state government had already anticipated the same type of thing.
So what do you see as the main argument coming from the Trump campaign? Is it just trying to get rid of as many ballots as possible, or does it differ from state to state?
That's a good question, Tyler. I think what we can say and what we've seen from the Trump campaign is that they're taking two basic arguments. One is challenging the deadlines and challenging ballots that come in after the deadline. What we see, for instance, in Georgia, the Trump campaign challenges 53 ballots, right? And in Pennsylvania, we have a lawsuit that is focusing on around 600 ballots from being counted in Montgomery County because those ballots weren't in their secrecy envelope. And so I think we see the Trump campaign going after a small number of ballots to implicate that the process, there might be something wrong with the process, but not actually targeting enough ballots to change the results. The other attempt that we see from, or approach that we see from the Trump campaign is largely around observing the counting of ballots. So delaying the process of counting the ballots, trying to slow down the process so that, and really I think what's at stake here is that they're trying to push the deadlines for certification of the actual vote. They're trying to really stall so that they can push the certification process past the state's deadline and really contest the results in a direct way and hopefully sort of affect the way that the Electoral College is voting in December.
So the last time there was as high-profile challenges to the election was back in 2000 in the Bush versus Gore presidential election. Back then, it was one state, Florida, separated by just about 500 votes. Here you have Pennsylvania, that's a 45,000 vote difference as of right now in favor of the former vice president. And you look at some of these other states, Michigan, 145,000 vote difference. So what are some of the similarities that you see between the 2000 election and the 2020 election? What are some of the differences?
So I think it's an interesting case for us to think about and compare this current election to, because there are multiple similar factors, right? So in the 2000 election, Gore wins the popular vote but loses the electoral vote because of Florida and because of inconsistencies in how ballots were, it was a lot of it was the whole like Chad situation with hanging Chads and pregnant Chads and having issues with understanding who people were actually casting their votes for. And then there were also issues of ballot design that made it really difficult for voters to know who they were casting their vote for. And so I think there are interesting parallels in 2020, but I think 2020 is a bit different for a lot of reasons. In the 2000 election, the competition over Florida drew a lot of, and this might be something we can take as sort of an indication of how things are going, but it drew a lot of attention from really well-known legal experts like Ted Olson, who ultimately takes Bush's case to the Supreme Court. In 2020, I think what we're seeing is the same sort of effects of polarization causing really tight races, causing the opportunity to make these challenges. But I think that the evidence here in 2020 is weaker for the Trump campaign. And I think we can note that, these very well-known attorneys that typically take on cases like this are avoiding doing so, right? We don't see them throwing their hat in the ring. So I think the evidence that the Trump campaign is bringing forward is less compelling than what we saw in the 2000 election. I also think the difference in the 2020 election is that there are more opportunities there are fewer opportunities, I guess, in terms of how Trump could win, right? So in 2000, Florida is the main turning point. But in 2020, Trump would have to win multiple of his challenges in multiple states to actually undermine and reverse the election results that we're seeing. So I think there are reasons that we should compare these things to one another, these instances, particularly because our political context is making elections tighter and tighter. And because the Electoral College isn't lining up with the popular vote. But I also think that there are fundamental differences in the legal evidence that these two court cases revolve around.
So we're talking about all these challenges, and so it was days after actual election day that the news outlets called the election for the former vice president. Is there any idea how long these challenges can go for? I know the Electoral College voters actually cast their votes on December 14th, so is that kind of like December 14th, that's the cutoff for anything that could potentially happen for the Trump campaign with lawsuits, or can it go further than that?
It can go further than that. It's unlikely to. So this strategy, I think, that we see from the Trump campaign to delay and try to surpass the certification deadlines is a strategy that I don't ultimately think will work out for him. The basic way that this process unfolds and works is that every state has their ability to create their own deadlines and their own laws regarding and regulating the election. So, for instance, Pennsylvania has a certification date of November 23rd, right? Other states have different certification dates. Some go into December. The ultimate sort of soft deadline for everything to be certified in every state and all of the contests to state results to be taken care of is December 8th. That's the safe harbor deadline. If the states cannot resolve their contested results by December 8th, then we're dealing with some issues in terms of the December 14th deadline for the electors to actually cast their votes. There is an additional deadline of December 23rd, and that deadline is when the Electoral College has to report the results back to the states. And so there are a couple of opportunities, I think, where we might see, if there are outstanding controversies, Americans still scratching their heads saying who won. And there are ultimately procedures and processes that we can go to in the instances that these things occur. I think it's highly unlikely that by December 14th we won't have a result.
Well, I think, as you said, over the next few weeks, it'll be very interesting. This thing is always evolving, and we see the hand recount that's going to happen in Georgia and some states still counting. But Dr. Courtney Broscious, appreciate you adding some context to this very complicated issue. We appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you for having me.